You raised some very significant points earlier, and I think it's amazing that actually truth isn't a concept, it's a person. And you also mentioned the correspondence theory of truth, which you seem to agree with, and also you use the word category there. And I want to pick up on that. There are many scientists and people of influence, including actors, who seem to make a category mistake. And they seem to make claims about God, for instance, that simply don't make sense, or are simply from a different category.
Mm-hmm.
They argue for a point using a different category. So, for example, many people would ask you, well, who created God? But if you ask who created God, it already implies that God has a beginning. It already implies a certain understanding of the concept and of the person of God. And also, many people would say, I don't believe in God because I don't believe in ancient deities or the Greek gods.
Yes.
And many people would come to me and say, you seem to be a rational, reasonably rational person. Surely you can't believe in God. We don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. When people say that, I feel that there's a different category that they put God and the idea of God into. And also you have people like Stephen Hawking who make similar claims outside of science. So how can Christians engage with these types of arguments?
Well, I'll tell you how I engage, and I think you're putting your finger on something immensely important, because that's often the main barrier that people put up. And if you can't get through that barrier, you don't get any further. I was doing a kind of interview debate in the Netherlands some time ago, and a professor of physics was put up against me. And he said, your faith in God is like belief in Santa Claus, the one you mentioned. So I thought I would do a little experiment. And I said, let's just test this a little. I said to the audience, how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as adults? And not a hand went up. And then I said, how many of you came to believe that Jesus was the Son of God as adults? So there were hundreds of hands. There were a couple of thousand people in the audience. And then I turned to this professor and I said, you know, I'm going to be very blunt with you. You're insulting this audience's intelligence, because the finest of minds have spent centuries understanding or trying to understand the nature of God because they believe in his existence. There is not a similar group of intellectuals studying Santa Claus because we all know he doesn't exist. So you are making a fundamental category mistake. Now, you mentioned Hawking, and I think he was a brilliant mathematician, but he had very little knowledge of philosophy.
In our popular culture, many people will simply take someone's argument for granted just because they are a person of authority. So, for instance, I saw a very popular actor saying, well, there is no God, and the way to prove this, he said, if you take the Bible and destroy it, for instance, in 1,000 years' time, you will never get anything like it. But if you get a book of science and destroy it in 1,000 years' time, you will get the exact same book because it follows certain tests. And it seems to me that these claims are very, very easy to refute. But because they were made by someone in authority, or someone like a scientist, for instance, if we say like Hawking, so who am I to disagree with Hawking in this aspect?
That's right. That's why I wrote my book about Hawking, because it had a trigger story. I had received a letter from a young man in Northern Ireland, where I self-evidently come from. And he wrote to me and said he was driving his car along the road and saw a hoarding saying, Stephen Hawking says there is no God. And he said it had a shock effect on him. He had to stop his car. And he thought to himself, well, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I to believe there is? And that's why I wrote my book, God and Stephen Hawking, because I do not think Stephen Hawking actually understood enough of philosophy or religion. And in fact, that was, interestingly enough, said by another person who's not a theist, Lord Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal. He said, I know Stephen very well, and he knows little philosophy and no theology, and I wouldn't listen to him on either of those two subjects. But because of this authority, and that's a huge question, and it's a question for me, because those of us who talk about these things, we're talking about subjects on this podcast that are not my main field. My main field is pure mathematics. So what right have I to talk about this? My answer to that is that if you go into a field that's outside your own professional expertise, you must consult the experts in that field. And I've tried to do that. I'm sure I failed to do it rigorously. But to give you an example of the opposite, and I'm afraid it's Dawkins again, he points out in one of his books, I think it's A God Delusion, that a good case can be made that Jesus never existed. Although he, fair enough, he said he wouldn't make the case himself. Well, if he wouldn't, why mention it? And he quotes a certain professor, but I looked up this professor, and this was a professor of German. In other words, there was no ancient historian he consulted. And that, to my mind, is a cardinal error. And I try to be extremely careful to trace sources of real experts in the field I go into. And I approach things at the level of what one might call the public understanding of science.
You mentioned that if you want to know about something, we would go to that's outside of our field of expertise, we'd ask the experts. Now, what about the lay Christian who doesn't understand philosophy or theology, but has faith in God? They can't explain the ontological argument or the argument from design, perhaps, but they still have faith in God. They can't quite argue, make a case for Jesus or a case for God. So what do you say to people who are not able to defend themselves with respect to their faith? So does that mean that because they don't have the evidence or are not able to point to the evidence, their faith is not valid?
Of course not. You don't have to understand electricity to be able to trust it and use it. I think the important thing here is not everyone is called upon to be, in that sense, an intellectual defender of the faith. And there must have been many Christians in the early church who were very grateful that people like Paul existed, because he was the defender. That's the first side of it. But there's another side to it, that explanation and argument are extremely important. Jesus argued. But when it comes to the defense of the faith, we often use the sorry word, apologetics, for that. I say sorry because transliteration from one language to another can be a dangerous thing, and that is exactly what's happened with the Greek word apologia, which simply means defense. It's now become an elitist topic for clever Christians and a sort of subdivision of Philosophy 101. But apologia is defending, and I find it very interesting that in most of the occasions it's used in the New Testament, and they are by Paul, or in that context by Luke describing Paul. His first line of defense is his experience of meeting the risen Christ on the Damascus Road. Now, it seems to me that therefore evidence splits into two rough categories, although there are grey edges between them, and they are the objective and the subjective. That some of us have been taught how to argue philosophically and so on, and that's very important. But that would be valueless in itself when it comes to God as person and Christ as person and Christianity as a personal relationship if we had no personal experience. So it seems to me that there are several, in that sense, categories of evidence. There's the evidence from the natural world. There's the evidence from logic, argument, and philosophy. But then there's the evidence from experience, from psychology, and finally, and very importantly, from history. And putting all those things together, I see it as a cumulative thing. But I would want to say that we haven't necessarily, and this is a wild generalization, we haven't in the Christian church done a good job of teaching people to answer questions, because, you know, you say Christians don't know how to defend it, but if they've had an education of any kind and they're living in a pluralistic, complex world, they're going to be faced with questions.
I think that's a very significant point you're raising. I think this is a major point in Christianity in general, the fact that some people would argue that Christians don't need to defend their faith. They just, because faith is believing in something that you cannot see. And of course many atheists would argue that all faith is blind faith. Yeah. And some would say, well, why study the evidence? Why look at the evidence? Because that somehow would probably make you doubt the existence of God as a Christian.
Yes.
What is your take on that?
Oh, well, my initial reaction is to say it's very superficial thinking, because if you go in to try to get a mortgage for a house, you'd better bring some evidence that you've got collateral to support your payments. And people all understand that. Indeed, the notion that faith is blind is a complete invention, that all faith is blind, is a complete invention of the so-called new atheists. Well, they're old now, because faith is an ordinary word from the Latin fides, from which we derive fidelity and trust, and the cognate words in most of the languages that are involved in the New Testament are words that lead us to think. You look at the OED on faith, and they will talk about evidence-based commitment or belief and trust. And we all know what that means, especially after the financial crisis, where we thought we could trust the bankers. And until evidence came back, it froze the entire market. I find on inquiry that people know what evidence-based faith is. And the difficulty is it's a total intellectual cop-out for atheists, and I know quite a few of them here in Oxford, who keep insisting that faith is a religious word and means believing where there's no evidence, because that actually absolves them from actually seriously considering any evidence, which I naturally want them to do. And I think we need to help Christians. I do believe that the average Christian can be taught, without having a scientific or humanities education to any high level, just common sense arguments that they can use to break through a lot of this stuff. And I do feel our churches ought to take more responsibility for doing it, especially dealing with this kind of argument from the pulpit, and not simply, and of course there are many churches that already do this, but there's a danger of confining Christianity to the devotional rather than having an intellectual dimension. When all these people go out to work, they have an intellectual dimension to their work, especially if they're professionals.
You touched upon this very briefly just now, on objective truth and subjective truth, and which leads us to this concept of moral relativity.
Yes.
Now, many people would argue that if you're making statements about God, for instance, then that's just your opinion. So if you say that there is a God, you can't really say that that's an objective truth. That's just your opinion.
I have a friend who says people only take that postmodern relativist view in areas that they think are not important. That's aside from the fact that I know that postmodern is a category within art, and I leave that aside. But this idea of moral relativity and truth relativity, people don't live like it because they can't live like it. And I think there again, it's important to get across to people that they do believe in truth to a very large extent. Otherwise, life would be utterly impossible. So this idea that we've shifted from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern in terms of chronology, I think is false. We can have all three in the same person, let alone in the same age.
let's move on and talk about how the universe came to be and the Big Bang, because obviously you're a mathematician and a scientist. What is the Big Bang, and what might have been there before the Big Bang, if we can contemplate the existence of time and whether something else existed before time was created?
Well, the Big Bang's a label on a mystery. The term was coined as a joke by Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, whom I met on several occasions to discuss these things, because he didn't like the idea of a start to the universe. And it simply means the universe started. And it's important to emphasize that, because I meet a number of Christians, and really they ought to know better, who are worried about that expression. It's simply saying there was a beginning, which is wonderful, because that's exactly what the Bible has been claiming for many millennia, which in itself is an interesting thing. I'm old enough to have lived through the 1960s, and I remember in the 1960s when the most powerful evidence to date came in that there was a beginning to space-time, which was then labelled the Big Bang. And interestingly enough, that idea had been suggested in the 1930s by a Belgian priest called Georges Lemaitre. And the fascinating thing in England was that this idea that there was a beginning was resisted at the highest levels of the scientific establishment. John Maddox was the editor at that time of Nature, and he said we mustn't go down that road because, and this is a partial quote, it gives too much leverage to those who believe in creation. And I was at a conference not so long ago with very distinguished philosophers, mathematicians, and physicists, and I was the token Christian, or one of them, who was asked to talk about this, asked your question, you see. And I quoted, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And I was interrupted, heckled from the audience by a very leading professor of physics who said, "Professor Lennox, I hope that you're joking when you suggest that the Bible has anything to say to us in the 21st century." And there was dead silence. Oh, I said, with a smile, I said, "No, I'm not joking at all." I said, "Actually, I would like to suggest to you that if science hadn't been so imprisoned by Aristotle's ideas of the eternity of the universe
and time,
that you might have taken another worldview more seriously, and that is the biblical one that's been saying for thousands of years that there was a beginning. And if you'd taken that worldview seriously, you might have looked for evidence and found it earlier than you did." I said, of course, Scripture is pre-scientific by definition in terms of chronology, but it's not pre-scientific in that it is not discussing the universe that you study. And although it doesn't say much about how God created, what it does say is of profound significance, particularly in the digital age, because it tells us, to put it in contemporary language from linguistics, that the universe was created not by unguided natural processes, but by a series of speech acts, and God said. And I said, in the digital age, that's fascinating. And one leading astronomer said to me, "How did they get that right?"
It's very interesting that you mentioned the speech act theory of John Austin. You also mentioned that somehow the Big Bang gives leverage to Christianity and also supports the idea that there was a beginning, that the universe might have come into being at one point in the past. Now, many atheists, the corollary of this is that many atheists would argue, on the other hand, that Christians have changed their views based on the evidence of scientific discoveries. So, for example, following Darwin and evolution theories, there are Christians who believe that actually we evolved and believe some sort of version of the evolution theory. What is your answer to that?
Well, there are 2 or 3 separate questions there, Samuel. Let's take the first one first. Do we use science in understanding Scripture? Of course we do. Here's a simple example. When Jesus said, I am the door, how do we know he wasn't saying he was made of wood or steel or plastic? Well, because we know about physical doors. We know something about, in that broad sense, science and technology. We can't avoid understanding words in Scripture without having the reference of the surrounding nature around us. So saying that we can't use science is absurd. We're already doing so. Secondly, I would say that one of the very interesting things is this. I look at science and at Scripture, and we must be careful to talk about the current state of science. In other words, the current state of science appears to me to be teaching that there was a beginning. That correlates with Scripture. I'm not saying that science won't change, or indeed interpretation of Scripture won't change. But to bore a bit deeper into the question, the notion, and it's possibly simpler to deal with it, you mentioned Darwinian evolution. Now, in every age, there will be Christians who will go overboard, as I see it, on the scientific side.
Chưa? Đây, tới vị trí này là 5, 1, 2, đúng rồi, 0,2. Đó, đồ thị dao động của nó như thế này nha các bạn. Thầy vẽ nó không được đẹp lắm, các bạn thông cảm dùm nha. Rồi, tiếp tục chúng ta qua câu tiếp theo. Chúng ta coi câu số 6 ha. Câu số 6. Hình bên là dao động điều hòa của một con lắc. Hãy cho biết vị trí và hướng dịch chuyển của con lắc tại thời điểm ban đầu. Đây. Hãy cho biết vị trí. Thì câu này nó cũng giống như cái câu trên thôi. Tại thời điểm ban đầu nè, vị trí nó ở đâu? Tức là T0 bằng mấy nè. Đúng không ạ? Tại thời điểm ban đầu T bằng 0 thì hỏi x0 của các bạn bằng bao nhiêu và nó chuyển động theo chiều nào. Đúng không ạ? Có thể theo chiều dương, có thể theo chiều âm. Được chưa? Như vậy mình nhìn vào đồ thị nè. Tại thời điểm ban đầu là T bằng 0 nè. Có phải vật ở vị trí có ly độ x0 là bằng 40 không ạ? Và đang đi xuống tức là đang đi về vị trí cân bằng. Tức là ban đầu nó đang ở vị trí biên dương, chuyển động về vị trí cân bằng. Như vậy chúng ta trả lời tại thời điểm ban đầu vật ở vị trí có ly độ cộng A, tức là bằng 40 cm đó, và chuyển động về vị trí cân bằng ngược chiều dương. Đúng không ạ? Ngược chiều dương. Đúng chưa? Các bạn chờ thầy chút nha. Rồi, đó là xong nội dung cái câu A của mình. Bây giờ chúng ta qua câu B nè. Biên độ chu kỳ tần số dao động của con lắc. Thì nhìn vào đây các bạn thấy biên độ là độ lệch cực.